Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night. Tonight's guest is Kameron Mazurek, and we'll be discussing how religion and politics inevitably go together.
And more, we're going to, since Cameron here is also a lawyer, we're going to go into, how religion has an effect on the laws and stuff like that. Nice to meet you, my good sir.
Yeah, good to meet y'all.
Tell the audience about yourself.
So my name was mentioned, Kameron Mazurek. I grew up in a small town on a farm and ranch. I worked on the farm and ranch since I was 9 years old until about 21. I got my bachelor's and master's and in accounting, and then I went to law school. So I'm an attorney and a CPA. I manage a law firm in the town I grew up in, and I own a CPA firm. I'm a partner in an insurance company, and I also own an investment company. And I have a huge fascination with religion, and from the time I was about 7 years old, the particular faith community I grew up in, we read the Bible once through, and then the New Testament again. And so I've done that since about 7 years old. But now that I have a family with two kids, I don't get to quite do that as routinely as I used to. So I read the Bible only about once every 2 years, and so that's my background, anyways.
Yeah. On your Twitter, it says you are a Rothbardian, I believe.
Yes, sir. That's correct.
So tell the audience a little bit what that entails.
So, if you go to my Twitter bio, it says I'm a Tolstoyan and a Rothbardian. Rothbardian is basically anarcho-capitalism, where people with that particular ideology are proponents of capitalism and kind of unrestricted capitalism, and without the enforcement of a monopolistic government. It's not necessarily that we're against governing rules. We're just against forced monopolistic government. And Tolstoyan is basically a Christian anarchist. So that's kind of, for me personally, I'm not really a strict pacifist, but I have pacifist sympathies. And Tolstoy was an inspiration for Gandhi, Martin Luther King. So kind of support that kind of tradition. And Rothbard was a political philosopher, legal philosopher, and an economist by education and professional background.
But don't you know Rothbard was a racist?
Yeah, a Jewish anti-Semite, I believe, is what they have also referred to him as. And me personally, my family's Jewish as well, so I guess I can be accounted to that as well.
Well, it depends. It depends on the woke person, if a Jew counts as a white person or an Asian.
Yeah, I've seen that recently. That Jews are very privileged.
Well, it's also works with Hispanics, where if you go to it's like with Kyle Rittenhouse. I found, he goes to school and everyone recognizes him as a Hispanic, but if he shoots people or whatever, he all of a sudden becomes a white person. So
Right.
there seems to be a transracialism that's going on here.
There's also a double standard that there's this crazy QAnon conspiracy theorist as a member of Congress, but we also have a squad of anti-Semites.
I do have one quick story. So I was in a litigation case, and the opposing attorney was trying to disqualify me, which basically, for the listeners, that just means they're trying to take me off the case where I'm not allowed to represent my client. And so they were trying to serve me in a counterclaim because I was a trustee on a deed of trust. So it was a foreclosure case, and they're trying to serve me as the trustee of the deed of trust, and it was Rosh Hashanah. And as I said, come from a Jewish background, so I followed the Jewish holidays. And Rosh Hashanah, I took off work, and they ended up serving me a couple of days later, so it wasn't a big deal. But at trial, they tried to disqualify me, saying that I lied and that I was not Jewish, and therefore should be disqualified. And of course, we put a stop to that. But that was what was shocking to me. That was the first time I ever encountered uh, something like, you're not really Jewish. So that was what was surprising to me.
No
Kind of
true
like,
Jewish fallacy.
kind of like us.
I mean, it's sort of funny. It's sort of like with you, Carlos, where people say you're not really Indian.
Who says that?
Twitter. I've always found it funny. It's like you're really telling a person that they don't know their ancestry.
Yes. Right. Speaking of Twitter, seeing Seth Rogen's meltdown on Twitter, he's always asking everybody he talks shit to, like, "Are you a Jewish person?"
Yeah.
I know. All right, so, good sir, what got you into law?
So it was something I wanted to do since I was pretty young. I wanted to be a lawyer and an accountant for a very long time. There's about a year in my junior year where I thought about nautical engineering, but I went back to wanting to be an attorney and CPA. But even since I was very little, I wanted to read political books. I wanted to read legal books, finance books. There's pictures of me when I was like probably 14 or so with like a Bill O'Reilly book. So I was very, very interested in politics and law and in finance. And so that I don't know if there's a specific instance in my life that, converted me to wanting to do that, but just kind of been born into me since I was little.
So, I mean, you just had a secret desire of wanting to lock black people up in prisons.
Yeah. Luckily, I don't do anything in the criminal side, and my focus is estate planning, taxes, guardianship, probate, and so really my duty is to try to protect, what people have worked their entire lives for. Protect it from the government, from taxation, or try to help them get on some kind of program for assistance or whatever, without having to get rid of all your hard-earned assets that you work forever to get.
Well, as you know, taxation is what?
Theft.
Yep.
Absolutely.
But yeah.
So let's get to the topic of the matter. Why are religion and politics inseparable in practicality?
So, with America itself, let's just start with our particular nation. We've kind of come from a unique background. People were fleeing the Netherlands or the Crown in England to start, to start their own kind of community. And we come from, whether we like it or not, we come from a Christian tradition. And one of those traditions is heavily influenced by Thomas Aquinas, and that is natural rights. And that view is that our rights are inalienable. In other words, they're part of our humanity. They're given by God. Now, I think you can be an atheist and also kind of agree with this as part of our nature and humanity, to have these particular rights. But Thomas Aquinas is probably the most famous for introducing it in an eloquent manner. And
well, yeah, of course. I know about that. There are atheist natural law theorists.
yeah,
So
and
the only thing that natural law theory really requires is teleology.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't necessarily have to be grounded in God in of itself.
Right. But with our unique situation, it was Thomas Aquinas as a theologian introducing this. And so the Puritans and even some, the kind of leftist Puritans, such as the Quakers, coming to America, kind of established a view of, okay, these are our agreed shared values of what it means to be individuals. Um, Once they came and established those communities, so there's different colonies, and each colony kind of had a religious diversity and had a religious aspect. In fact, what's interesting is Rhode Island was the least respected of the colonies because they thought they were a bunch of crazies. And whenever they first had their first, I believe the first Continental Convention to discuss whether we wanted to secede from England, Rhode Island didn't show up, and everyone was actually relieved that they didn't show up because these were the crazy people. So we had this shared view of we're all from different backgrounds, but these religious backgrounds give us a umbrella of shared values, and again, that is an inalienable rights. And I think that Judeo-Christian background is one reason we can't quite separate what is the legal establishment and as well as religious background, if that makes sense.
Oh, but according to the woke establishment, to tell the real history of our country, we have to go back to 1619 and go from there.
Right. Yeah.
Which our country wasn't founded until 1776.
Oh, but don't tell them that.
Yeah.
It was,
It's sort of funny.
it was all slavery on the way forward.
I know, it's sort of ridiculous. But anyway, I want to say about a very a very contentious issue that always comes up in circles is the First Amendment, and the separation of church and state. Um, Obviously, that has always been a factor in things like the Baker trials of the baker refusing to make a gay wedding cake, and you have Christians that don't want to make, they don't want to participate in any way, shape, or form in a gay wedding. Um, what has been your take on that and the separation of church and state?
So I can give you, I'll give you three answers. One of the answers is kind of the legal reality we're in. I can tell you what I think the constitutional reality is supposed to be, and kind of my opinion of what it should be. The first one is the kind of legal reality. The legal reality is, yes, you have a right to have any religious belief that you want, right? You can be a Scientologist, Christian, Muslim, atheist, whatever. But that does not protect you from acts, right? You can believe that you need to sacrifice your first son to appease Baal, right? But that does not give you a First Amendment protection to actually sacrifice your son. Now, that's an extreme example versus, say, baking a cake or being racist or some kind of bigot or whatever. That is, that you can have those beliefs, but you can't act on them. So that's kind of the legal reality that we're in, and then so there's some instances where you cannot act on those certain religious beliefs. So that's the reality we're in. Constitutionally, I think there is also in the First Amendment there is right of association. Right, you can associate with who you want to and who you don't want to, and which has long been part of our constitutional system. But with the Civil Rights Act, they brought in the Commerce Clause, right? Yeah, you can associate with only white people, or you can only associate with African Americans. And it brought in the Commerce Clause with the Civil Rights Act saying uh, basically you have to interact with African Americans and do business because that affects interstate commerce. And that you can kind of bring that into with the cake baking thing, right? If you don't bake a cake for somebody, and if you're in Arizona and you don't bake a cake for somebody that has a wedding in California, that impacts the Commerce Clause because that's two different states. So that's how they get around that. My personal belief, and I say this again as someone who's Jewish, I'm not a big fan of that because if somebody is like a Nazi, like a legitimate Nazi, hates Jews, I don't want to pay them. I want a sign that says no Jews allowed, right? I don't want them to have to take that sign down and take my business because I don't want to be funding this guy. That's my choice too, as a consumer, to say no. I'm not going to give this guy money who may be using my money to spread pamphlets that are anti-Semitic. Why would I want to do that? I would rather that guy tell me no, I don't want Jews allowed, no Jews allowed. I'd rather that be the reality than saying yes, you have to bake a cake for a Jew or homosexual or whatever.
I mean, a thing about that is, you bring up a good case. It doesn't really get rid of racism. It just moves it underground.
Right.
So, whereas if someone is just openly racist and says, no, I don't like Jews, I don't like black people, I don't like gay people. Now, gays, blacks, and Jewish people can see that guy and say, oh, well, I'm not doing business with you. F off. But now the courts are basically saying, no, you're not gonna know if that guy's the racist or not, and he's gonna be using it, and he has to take your money.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's the problem with these laws. From my perspective, is they all they do is hide. They create a facade. They don't create a reality. I think Thomas More wrote basically in one of his pieces of literature is the king can't get rid of gravity, right? You can't declare gravity's gone. Same thing with racism. You can't just with a stroke of a pen get rid of racism or bigotry or anything like that. That comes from a different way. That comes from something different, and just forcing people to do something for someone else that they don't want to do is not going to create a utopian world. All it's going to do is just hide that.
And it could, at the very worst, inflame them.
Same with the censorship. Like, it usually has the opposite. It almost always has the opposite effect. The Streisand effect. Like, you know what that is?
Yeah.
It tends to have the effect that it makes the matter worse than it would be before.
Yeah, and like I said, with all the, take Twitter for example, with all the Twitter bans, I kind of want that. Like I said, as a Jew, I kind of want to see that, right? I want to know who is somebody famous that says something bad or whatever. And to me, I think dialogue does a lot more as far as resolving those issues rather than trying to suppress that dialogue. One of my favorite people is Dave Smith, and he was talking to a guy, Hotep Jesus, and they were saying that Hotep Jesus is an anti-Semite. He's African American. And then Dave Smith, who's Jewish, they were saying that he was racist and that they shouldn't be talking to each other. But if you take what people are, who are antagonistic against them at their face value and say, yes, Dave Smith is racist and Hotep Jesus is anti-Semitic, and they're talking, is that what you want? You want these two people to come together and understand each other? To me, I think that's a good thing.
Anyway, as a while we're on this subject, as a lawyer, do you see any legal ramifications in the future about the tech tyrants that have decided to take control?
Uh, I mean, if you, I don't really see anything that at least on the federal government level. I don't think the federal government can do a whole lot. I mean, you might can abuse the Commerce Clause like federal government has done for a very long time since the FDR days. They can abuse that and say, getting rid of somebody is affecting Commerce Clause, interstate commerce. But there's no First Amendment issue, right? It is a private company. They have a user agreement that I'm pretty sure nobody has ever read, but it has agreed to it. And so, as far as that goes, I don't see them. You can use the Sherman Act as far as antitrust, but that wouldn't be a censorship. Censorship would be a side issue, maybe related to it, but the main focus would be whether or not they're acting in a monopolistic way. So, as far as actually stopping it, I think that's going to come more from the consumer, and the consumers of Twitter, Facebook, or whatever will have more power than what the federal government has.
The main problem is that these private platforms are basically acting like publishers.
Right.
Well, to me, the biggest problem more so is that they're heavily subsidized by the government.
Yeah, and that is so you can put strings in government contracts, right? So, for example, one of the big things is I'm not sure if Biden has done it yet, but there's discussions of having a federal $15 minimum wage for government contracts, right? So if they contract with a private company, they have to pay a $15 minimum wage. So you can put strings in all these government contracts with private companies, whether it's Facebook or Amazon or whatever, with the Amazon the hosting stuff that we've seen with Parler. You can put stuff in their contracts that say, okay, you have to do this or you can't do that. So that is one way the government can do it, can resolve issues that are perceived to be a problem.
Yeah, but another problem is that they're not really private companies anymore in the realistic sense. They're more like they're basically the public square now.
Yeah, you can definitely make that argument. I think that's a little bit harder argument, right? Because say, for example, back before the internet days, right? You had only newspapers, and you take the most popular newspaper who had letters to the editors, which is kind of what Twitter is, right? A letter to the editor. That particular newspaper of Twitter is only letters to the editor. Just from a constitutional standpoint, I think it's going to be hard to argue that they are a public square just because they're just a new form of a letter to the editor type thing.
Like I've always said, my only real problem with it is of all the government subsidies and how they're pretty much propped up by the government. Where, like, with YouTube and stuff like that, they've actually said that YouTube doesn't really make any money at all. It gets paid through ads and through government subsidies. So, so basically, like, they've already said it. If you tried to run a company like YouTube, if like you made a business trying to compete with YouTube, you would crash and fail because YouTube doesn't really make money. It more or less gets ad revenue, and it gets money from the government. So I think that's mainly where a lot of people have a problem with it.
Yeah, and I'm very sympathetic to that view of as a Rothbardian, that anybody that is subsidized by the government, and especially if they're heavily subsidized by the government, you're not really, in a realistic standpoint, a private company. Just like you can say, or how legally the Federal Reserve is a private institution, even though the board is appointed by the president and approved by the Senate, and they're the only one that has some monopolistic power to print money. But it is a private institution according to the legal reality. But like I said, I'm very sympathetic. It's not really, they're not really private companies in that sense, but in the legal world that we're in today, they are. And just kind of looking at the legal landscape, I don't think they can be classified as same thing as being on the courthouse steps yelling, in the Fed or whatever. It's not a First Amendment issue. It's still a private company, just in the legal world we're in.
But now that we've gotten out of the weeds, so back to where we left off on the main topic at hand about religion and politics.
Yeah, so to me, where religion plays a key role is understanding, at least in constitutional decisions, is understanding why we have our particular values. And like I said, it all comes down to these inalienable rights. And unfortunately, in today's world, even in law, let me go back and give you a little bit of history, my history in law school. We had constitutional law in our first year. Your first year in law school, pretty much everybody that is a law student has constitutional law their first year. We didn't even read the Constitution. It's all about precedent. Whatever this court decided, this is the linear history of this decision, so that's the direction it has to go. And so it doesn't even mention like inalienable rights that's founded in our Declaration of Independence. And the Declaration of Independence is kind of seen as one off document that declared our independence. It has no legal ramifications from then on, except for that particular aspect, which I find kind of tragic, because that inalienable rights, I think, is so valuable to understanding why we have a constitution. The British Parliament and the British government at that time, and still to this day, does not have a written constitution. And they have an unwritten, living, breathing document, so to speak, that's not written down. And so our founding fathers thought, no, there are inalienable rights that you cannot take from mankind, that are born by God as part of us. And that's the reason we have to write it down. We have to write these things down in opposition to the way the British style is. And that was so fundamental to the founders. And the founders were not monolithic in their religious beliefs. Right, one of my heroes is Thomas Jefferson, who was not a traditional Christian, to say the least. He had his own Jefferson Bible, where he took out what he believed were the ridiculous part of the Bible, which is like anything related to miracles. He thought that was ridiculous. And then we had Thomas Paine, who was deist, and he thought Christianity was ridiculous, and had very strong sympathies for the French Revolution, who tried to get rid of Catholicism, and he thought that was a good idea. So we had all these diverse views, but this religious aspect of inalienable rights, that there are certain rights of mankind. Now, one of the problems I see that is not often addressed by fellow natural right people like myself is well, what are those rights? And I think that's a hard question that we have not done a very good job of explaining. What rights do we have? What rights don't we have? Um, and I think that needs to be expounded upon a lot better.
Yeah, makes sense. I would say that Thomas Paine, a lot of his, since I'm pretty much an expert on him, it's funny that, he was more anti-clerical than he was anti-religion per se.
Right.
He very much hated what the church had become in his day. And what was pretty, if you read his book, Age of Reason, he does make sure, like, after he's buried, the church and stuff like that, he makes sure to state at the very end of it, look, but none of this criticism applies to Jesus, whom I believe was a moral teacher. So he did try to distinguish his hatred, his abject hatred for the Christian churches of his day and Jesus. And that was, I think, sort of where he was. And I've always found it funny enough that people have I think it was Theodore Roosevelt that called him a dirty atheist.
Yeah.
And I'm like, you didn't read his book, did you?
Well, speaking of Roosevelt, you gotta admire the balls on politicians back in the day, where politicians would do what we've seen today at this pathetic display of crying and weeping on the House floor and over exaggerating that narrative, where Roosevelt gave a 40-some minute speech, what with a bullet lodged in his chest.
Yeah, after assassination attempt. Yeah.
No need to panic, but I've been shot, but here we are. Let's get on with this.
Yeah, I know. It's funny because someone tried to assassinate him, and they shot him right in the chest during his speech, and he just stood there and held his chest a bit and just said, "Well, I'm going to still keep giving my speech. I came here to do this speech. I'm getting it done with." It turns out that the reason why he could do that is because the bullet had hit a locket that was in his jacket. So the locket protected him from a big of the impact of the bullet.
Then you got the guys like Jackson, who the left hates now, despite being the founder of the Democratic Party. But he won a duel and chased down his assassin and beat him with a cane.
Yeah.
They call him Old Hickory for a reason. Because he walked with a cane and wasn't afraid to use it.
He was pretty young. He's I want to say he's 7 or 12, somewhere around there. And the British is during the Revolutionary War, and the British was staying at, I guess, his parents or grandparents, aunts, uncles, somebody's house that was related to him. And he didn't like the way that the officer was treating his family. And here he was, a little kid, and he bowed up to the British officer, and the British officer hit him with a knife or sword or bayonet. Anyways, gave him a scar on his face. So Old Hickory is kind of like that from his youth.
Yeah, it's pretty funny about how, I think politicians were much more, how you can say, out there and more tough than they are sort of now. Well, now that we have a new president, what was your take on the former president, Donald Trump?
So I found him entertaining, I guess,
Or,
is the best way to describe it.
Man.
I look forward to every day on Twitter, waking up in the morning, see what he's been saying at 4 o'clock in the morning. And as far as actual ideology, like I said, I'm a Rothbardian, so very, very few things he actually did I agree with. But I think what he kind of represented as kind of a screw you guys type of thing. He he had a lot of enemies that, that I thought were also enemies. People lost their minds over him over I thought were trivial things. You had people like take like George Bush and Barack Obama. Barack Obama literally assassinated an American citizen without any due process and killed his 16-year-old son in Yemen. But that's cool, I guess, according to kind of the establishment view. But if Donald Trump didn't do didn't get us into any new wars, and people threw a fit about that. And then the one time where I didn't think he should have, but he bombed Syria, and people can't remember MSNBC or CNN were saying he finally became our president today. I'm like, is that something you should be cheering?
What I find funny about all this is that everybody loved him before he decided to become president.
Yeah, I mean, he won an award from the NAACP. And like I said, he's not my favorite president at all.
No.
I'm not trying to defend the guy, but to say that he was literally Hitler, if that was our aspiration was Hitler, as a Jew, I'm kind of disappointed. He didn't kill millions of people, so kind of fell short of that.
No, it's mainly because he decided to stick it to the establishment. Like he and his followers, the reason why they're so sycophantic towards him is because they realize the system is broken, and they'll look to anybody who's a contrarian and willing to stick it to the establishment. He even says so when he decided to run for president. He's like, I'm going to shake these guys up a bit.
Right.
I mean, I always, funny enough, me and my friend here, we all know it, is like, we always called the Trump's presidency the presidency of Orange Man and Mr. Sparky. Mr. Sparky being Mike Pence.
Right.
And because of his little thing with conversion therapy.
Yeah.
So that was always a running gag. I would ask people, like this was when Trump was still president, and I would ask people, hey, what do you think of Orange Man and Mr. Sparky? And people would generally, that would generally make a good conversation right there. What's your take on the new administration with Joe Biden so far?
To me, I think it's more of the same. People are worried about him being far left. Traditionally, he's not been far left. He's kind of in the middle. And just like when my clients come in, they're worried. Where I live, it's very much an agricultural area. They're all farmers and ranchers. And something that, you hear about the death tax, and people say, well, that only affects rich people. Well, no, it doesn't. It affects highly capitalized people, such as farmers and ranchers who may have, $5 million of assets, and those assets are in equipment that are rusted over. It's in land, it's in cattle, sheep, goats, stuff like that. Like I said, maybe worth $5 million. And if, back, several years ago before the Trump 2017 taxes, these farmers and ranchers, when they passed away, their children had to sell quite a bit of land to pay for the death tax. And so that's always been a concern for the clients after the new administration. But I don't think that's much of a concern. It's 50-50, right? And you have a conservative Democrat and Manchin, and Sinema is somewhat moderate. And so I don't think a whole lot's going to change. I think it's going to be kind of like what Trump did, right? Everything that Trump did was an executive order, except for the tax bill. And I think that's what, to get anything done, I think that's what Biden's going to have to do is through executive order. And as we've seen since January 20th, that's pretty much all he's done is executive order. And looks like some of the legislation that's coming through Congress is just a resolution to ask Biden to do a an executive order. So I don't see a whole lot changing. And if anybody's looking for Biden to be a major change, they're going to be disappointed just from his history. And what I remind people, he came in fifth in New Hampshire, right? And he came in third or fourth in Iowa. So the first two primaries and caucuses, even the Democrats didn't really want him. And so he was the compromised candidate, and he's going to be the compromised president.
Well, yeah, he's not far left himself, but his policies
about
are.
how people say, well, he's so good for the LGBTQ community. And I'm like, he opposed gay marriage almost his entire political career. It wasn't until 2012 when he read the writing on the wall in the polls that he switched his mind.
Yeah, pretty much when the Supreme Court said, okay, gay marriage is a legal fundamental right, is when kind of right before then, anyways, the Obama administration, which included Vice President Biden, basically came out and said, okay, this very last second, we're going to be for it.
So, yeah, I mean, they sort of seen the writing on the wall. So, I mean, I found it funny that Trump, of all people, was actually the first president we've ever had that was openly for gay marriage going into it.
Yeah, he was. And it's interesting, it's the Republican Party that was, and not the Democratic Party. And going back to religion and law, I think religion impacts culture. It's a part of culture that defines culture itself. And laws, a lot of time, whenever it describes going back to natural rights, culture sometimes defines what those natural rights are. And I think we saw that in gay marriage, where the culture defined what that gay marriage is acceptable before the Supreme Court actually found it a fundamental right, right? Most of America thought that gay marriage was okay, or at least should not be illegal. Not necessarily that it's okay, but shouldn't be illegal or banned. And so Supreme Court, the law itself kind of follows whatever culture kind of agrees with, which can be a good thing and also can be a dangerous thing.
Now, a common thing that Democrats are now doing is they're labeling anyone that disagrees with them as a threat to our democracy.
Assuming we live in a democracy.
Well, I've always said we basically live in a democracy in name only, but we're functionally an oligarchy.
Yeah, I can be sympathetic to that. There's only a certain extent of allowable opinion. You have Democrats and Republicans, so there are only two parties allowed. There's other parties out there, but they aren't given the same opportunity as the other two, right? Every time, say for example, Libertarian Party is the third biggest political party out there, and every time they make those gains, there's an extra hurdle. And the same thing with even some of the primary candidates. Every time one of the primary candidates that's not in the mainstream starts making headway, we saw this with Ron Paul and the Congresswoman. I can't remember her name right now, but from Hawaii. Every time, Tulsi Gabbard. Every time Ron Paul or Tulsi Gabbard, made some headway, then they changed the rules, and all of a sudden they couldn't be in. So I'm very sympathetic and agree that as kind of old, these only few people are allowed to be the acceptable ones. And I think that's the reason Trump was such a threat, was because he was not part of that acceptable party.
Yeah.
And because the politicians couldn't control him.
Well, I mean, it's because Trump had a lot of FU money.
Right.
Where I've always found it absolutely hilarious when he was debating Republicans, and they were saying, Like they were talking bad about him, and he was saying, "You know how much money I donated to your campaigns prior to this?"
Oh man, those debates were the best. I mean, it kind of shows you the whole charade of the entire thing. Uh, Again, like I said, I'm not a Trump apologist, but I think that's what was one of the best things about his campaign was just like I am everything that you supposedly love and hate all at the same time, and it made it all so much more beautiful and like I said, so much more entertaining.
And
I
another reason.
loved it. I loved him when he was like, I'm not a fan of Trump myself, but I would say I did get a little chuckle every now and then when he would come up with names for his political opponents, like
Yeah.
with Crazy Nancy, um, Sleepy Joe,
Lion Ted.
Pocahontas, Elizabeth Warren. I did find that hilarious. Like Trump is like the master of like the wrestling promo.
Like
Yeah.
he was, say what you want about him, but he was an excellent troll.
Yeah, I think he was
Yeah,
one of the best.
that's not really a
trolls there.
quality I want in a president, but it is someone I can find funny.
That's another reason why people love him now. He's not your typical politician. He says what's on his mind, literally whatever's on his mind.
Yeah, yeah. There's no filter there when there probably should be. And
Yeah.
what I thought was funny, when they banned him from Twitter and all the social media, all these reporters who've been very critical of him all of a sudden said, "Now this feels, this is not a good feeling. We don't know what he's saying." Yeah, or what his thoughts are. So they've been on a 4-year campaign to ban him, and now once he's banned, they're like, well, this is not good. We don't know what he's thinking. We don't know what he's doing.
That's one of his main.
What's he thinking in the Oval Office?
That's one of his many problems. He didn't he could have done all this. He had 4 years to prevent what's happening now. These dystopian things that are happening as we speak. He had 4 years to fix all that, and he didn't do jack shit. He talked the good talk, but he didn't walk any of it.
Yeah. He's a promoter, like Mr. Price is saying. He's a boxing promoter. He's not actually in the ring fighting. He's promoting the whole show.
Remember, we're gonna go to march towards the Capitol, and I'll be right there with you. He wasn't there. He wasn't anywhere near there.
Yeah. I mean, speaking of that, as a lawyer, what do you think about the case of his impeachment, his second one at that?
So far he makes up half of all the impeachments we've had in history. So I guess that's something he can claim. So kind of going, I kind of agree with Rand Paul in the sense that I don't think is constitutional. Whether that's setting aside whether he deserves it or not, I think he deserves to be impeached for different reasons. I think it's kind of crazy he's being impeached for this because I think Maxine Waters has said much worse than Donald Trump has. But I think it's unconstitutional because the whole purpose of impeachment is to get rid of sitting people, right? So if you convict somebody, it removes them from office, and then you can add on an additional piece of legislation that says they can no longer run for office again, which I think is kind of their primary goal, but they don't have the votes to do that, to convict anyways. But like I said, the whole purpose is to remove them from office. He's already been removed, right? Joe Biden's our president.
So he doesn't run again. But what are the chances he's going to get elected again? They're going to let it happen.
Well, I mean, the thing is that it wouldn't stop him from running. It would just bar him from taking office.
Yeah, it'd bar him from taking office, and it kind of depends on what he wants to do. If he wants to pull a John Quincy Adams, where he goes to after the presidency, he goes to Congress, or he becomes a governor or something like that. He may have that in mind, but I think that's what they're trying to prevent is him being a senator or congressman. But they don't have the votes. I mean,
or pulling off of Grover Cleveland.
Yeah, Grover Cleveland.
That would be hilarious if he did that. I always said I wish he actually did win because it would have been funny to see how many times they could have impeached him in 4 more years.
Yeah,
Shows his impeachment don't mean shit. And like
He
we
would have
need
been the first president to be impeached like 4 or 5 times in his entire term.
we need someone like Tulsi Gabbard because she's willing to actually stand up to the tech tyrants and do all the stuff that he failed to do. And if he ever becomes president again, she's gonna divide people even more, and it's just gonna result in chaos.
yeah, and I mean, kind of going back to what we said, like even the people that like helped him get there and were kind of on his side, such as Julian Assange, right? With WikiLeaks, I think you can easily show that was very sympathetic to Trump over Hillary. He didn't sign any pardon or anything like that for Julian Assange. So that, like you said, I think he's just going to create more division if he does run again. But it would make for some good Twitter and television.
Yeah. I remember, there's a big thing with California and Texas where they've both been saying they want to secede. House and Texas is what they're calling them both. So I'm saying, so at least we can say secession is a bipartisan want. It looks like the Democrats and Republicans can both agree that they just absolutely hate each other.
Oh, and do you also see these allegations of Christian nationalism a threat, or is that just leftist propaganda?
So are you asking if I think it's a threat or what?
Yeah, if it's
so
since it's the topic of religion politics.
So to give a little bit of history of kind of Christian nationalism from a fundamentalist standpoint that we've seen in our particular American history, a lot of that did not start until Roe versus Wade. Whenever that came out, it kind of started a culture war. Yeah, that's whenever we had the moral right, moral majority come into play. That's when we kind of saw Christianity embracing kind of the Republican Party or nationalism. So it's actually a very, very recent thing in American history. And like on my Twitter bio, I'm a Tolstoyan. So I'm a Christian anarchist. So I have like to say I have no loyalty, I guess, on a from a political standpoint. No king but Christ. So I don't think that Christian nationalism is a good thing. I don't think any time a Christian identity has been associated with a government has been a good thing, right? Any of the Christians that are associated with the Roman Empire, it did not turn out well, right? Because he ended up becoming a persecutor.
More on that after you're done. Remind me.
And then with Christianity, for me personally, I'm a big proponent of absolute separation of government and Christianity.
Absolutely.
Going back to my Rothbardian roots, I think that government corrupts Christianity. I don't think Christianity corrupts government, but I think government corrupts Christianity. So embracing that is never a good idea, I think.
Yeah, especially because you got all this cult of personality that sort of went all the way back to the beginning with Washington, and then even more so with Lincoln and Roosevelt's, and then after the Roe v. Wade and the culture war thing you mentioned, they lashed on to Reagan as their hero, and then it went on from there, and now you have this sycophantic hero worship of Trump now.
Right, yeah.
But hey, Cameron, don't you know that the Republican Party is the small government party?
Anyway, they're trying to think they're actually going back to their ancient roots like they did with the Roman emperors, where the Roman emperor seen as this agent of God on earth. Like, it's kind of similar, but back then it was much more aggrandizing with the Roman and Byzantine emperors.
Yeah, and so you can argue that Christianity is a utopian religion, but in Christianity, we believe that utopia is not now. That utopia is in the future. And I think what Christian nationalism has done is saying, no, we can make that utopia here and now today. If we just pick the right person, whether it's Reagan, Trump, Carter, whoever, to be this perfect Christian, well, all that does is hurt your cause because you latch onto these people and they're not these utopian people. They're they're humans, right? At best, as far as their flaws, and at worst, they're evil people. And it has this terrible history of just failing every single time. And this recent view of Trump being the wonderful evangelical, I'm like, just from his own statements and past behavior, he's not going to bring this Christian revolution that you think he's going to bring.
I mean, yeah, he committed adultery multiple times, and he's on record saying that he's done that. And his obviously his statement of grabbing women by the what. That doesn't seem like when I'm thinking of WWJD, I'm not really thinking grab them by the really is in there.
Grab
Right.
by the pussy. Basically says damn, I've lost my train of thought. Go ahead.
I think personally Trump is Republican, like in the sense that he's what the Republican Party thinks but are too afraid to say. They really didn't clue him in on what he's not supposed to say.
Yeah, and I think Trump is the kind of epitome of the old Republican Party, right? He's pro-tariff and all this. He is the Henry Clay, right? Henry Clay was a Whig, and Henry Clay is kind of the philosophical father of the Republican Party, and everything Lincoln said, which our first Republican president, he said he got from Henry Clay, and Henry Clay was very much a proponent of the government comes first, and it needs to be the federal government, and needs tariffs, and big business is more important than the average person, and that's kind of how Lincoln did it, and that is very much in line with what Trump did. Right, everything he did was very much pro business, which as a unrestricted capitalist, I am pro business too, but not in the sense of certain protections that Trump did.
That's also why the half of evangelicals, there's one half that go with the woke bullshit. Then you got the other half that stick with Trump because they think he's going to fulfill what their desires. And like Reagan, he actually doesn't hate their guts. He paid attention to them, like the ugly chick in high school. And there's the real popular guy in charge says, "I love you," and they just latch on to it.
All right. So we're almost coming up on the hour mark. I would like to ask you like a little final question, since this is something that's been on my mind. Are you aware of the concept of a worker cooperative? And what's the opinion on them?
So, to me, from a legal, philosophical Christian standpoint, I don't have a problem with those. I don't think they really work in the long term. There may be some that work. To me, the main problem is incentive. There's too many incentives going the wrong direction. That's the reason if you look at every single successful company that is a rags to riches story is not some kind of worker cooperative thing, right? It's kind of a benevolent dictatorship. You have somebody that knows how to employ capital very well. He may give incentives to those employees, but those have to be directed in a way that employ those assets and capital in a means that best serve the customers. And worker associations tend not to focus on customer service, right? What's best for the customer. They tend to focus on what is best for the worker condition. And so they lose that capital asset that would help worker conditions because they're too focused on worker condition. If you help focus on client or customer services, your worker conditions improve.
I bring it up because that seems to be a thing that socialists are really latching onto as worker cooperatives. Because in their mind, that fulfills the whole collective means of ownership.
Yeah, and again, as a Rothbardian, I think that's a kind of a utopian view, where you put you still have the problem of selfishness, right? Selfishness is always going to be there, and I think capitalism and private ownership and all that is the best way to put away selfishness in order to help people. Again, worker cooperation. I don't have any problem with it from the standpoint of it being voluntary, but perhaps one instance, from a Jewish background, we have kibbutz in Israel, right? Those are worker cooperation type things, and they almost every single one of those have failed, and the ones that have survived are the ones who have abandoned that kind of ideology. So I think we have some empirical evidence of worker that type of ideology not succeeding.
All right. Well, we're past the hour mark. Would you like to tell the audience where they can find you?
Yeah, so I'm on Twitter at Kameron Mazurek. I also have a religion blog and a podcast. If you go to religiouslearning.com, you can find all that there. I'm also on Apple Podcast, Religious Learning Program. Also on Facebook, Religious Learning. My business is Mazurek Belden and Burke, PC. That's the law firm, and Cameron W. Mazurek PLLC is the CPA firm, and Circle M Insurance Services is my insurance company.
Any future projects that you have that you're working on that you like to tell the audience about?
So my main thing is I'm working on several more podcasts coming down the pipeline. I'm going to have some people that are associated with some scholars coming out, and I don't write a whole lot on religious learning, but I got several editorials coming out that kind of we're going to have a focus on Christianity and war, and what Christians should, or how they should view war. And I think that's something that's left out of Christianity, and especially in today's world, and kind of what they can do about it. And so I'm pretty excited about that particular project.
Well, I mean, war, what is it good for, man?
Absolutely nothing.
All right. Well, it was nice talking to you, man.
Yeah, great talking with you.
All right, go follow Cameron, and we'll see you next time. God bless.